So I'm going live. I'm in Hollywood, California. It's my birthday. I'm down here. Drove about 7 hours from my home in Northern California to be here for a conference in Hollywood that's being put on by a really cool institute, the Institute of Transactional Philosophy. And we're going to talk about all kinds of things, worldviews, and ethics, and the idea of transaction, which most of the people here for this conference will be business people, executives, trying to engage philosophically to think about how they and why they do business. And I've been down to Southern California to meet with this institute before. It's always different people that come to these talks, though, so I don't really know what to expect. But I figured I would hop on live here and talk about that a little bit, but also just see who shows up. Hey, Ashton. I don't usually do these sorts of live video streams, but I figured it's a special occasion, and I have a lot on my mind. I mean, I'm thinking about this conference I'm at, but I'm also thinking about the nature of birth and death and the life between, as I titled this. And that title can mean a lot of things. And I'm not sure how many of those things I'll be able to get into, but I was really just curious to see who might turn up and what kind of questions and comments and interaction and participation I might get. Someone's asking if I've ever read Collingwood's autobiography, and I absolutely have not. What's going on? So yeah, I mean, the title is a possible topic for me to talk about, but I kind of just want to let the room take shape and see what happens. MacIntyre, haven't. I've been thinking about reading MacIntyre for a long time. The number of books that I have yet to read is a source of tremendous pain and anxiety. But I hope to read MacIntyre one day soon. Oh, nice. Well, tell me about MacIntyre if you were a student of his, whoever B is. Is my volume too low? Let me see what I can do about that. No, it sounds good. All right. I don't have my normal equipment, just my fancy MacBook with a built-in mic. B says I asked him for a reading recommendation one time. He told me to read Collingwood's autobiography. Interesting. I know Collingwood has a book on nature. I read a little bit of that. Is it called The Idea of Nature, I think? Because he mentions Whitehead in there, as I recall. But was there a reason given for why you should read Collingwood's autobiography? What's going on in there? I mean, I love autobiographies of philosophers because generally ideas are just kind of floating out there in intellectual space. But when you hear the life of the philosopher who thought of those ideas, who participated in those ideas, not only more sense, but a different kind of sense. They gain a degree of relevance, I think, and sometimes a philosopher's life and a philosopher's ideas are so far apart, and other times, or they seem far apart, right? And other times they're really aligned, and that's always interesting too. Jay Lizard says Lucretius. Not sure what that's a response to. It's kind of weird that I'm so used to like a Zoom video conference with lots of people who can just chime in with their own voices. But now I guess I'm the center of attention, so all you get is some comments that you can throw in as chat messages. Oh well. So Jay Lizard, if there's some reason you're mentioning Lucretius, I'd love to hear about it. It's interesting you bring him up though, because the whole ancient Greek school of atomism, Epicurus and Lucretius and Democritus and so on, is something I've been thinking about lately because I've been reading Kant's theory of the heavens, his natural history, universal history, he calls it. And he starts out by talking about the atomists and how easy it would be to view what he's trying to do as a form of materialism. But he's like, don't worry, I'm a Christian. And all of this, at the end of the day, just makes the existence of God all the more proven, right? All the more firmly proven. So Kant was definitely trying to be pious with his materialism, which is so weird, the way that Christianity took that turn. I mean, it's weird until you understand the evolution of consciousness, I guess. But anyways, let's see what B says about Collingwood's autobiography. In the end of the day, it's about approaching philosophy historically. That's why Collingwood was recommended. Yeah. Collingwood gives you a good framework to compare thinkers who weren't contemporaries. That's important. I mean, that's exactly what the evolution of consciousness is for, as a framework to compare thinkers who weren't contemporaries and understand how they're related. I mean, Vico and the whole biblical tradition really, but Vico was one of the earlier philosophers of history that I think gave us a sense of this, and Hegel, of course. Collingwood's carrying that forward. B says, two statements can't be considered contradictory unless both are intended to answer the same question. The definition of a problem is the set of questions you must answer to solve it. Yeah. I mean, the idea that two statements can't be considered contradictory unless both are intended to answer the same question. I mean, that's kind of how Hegel's dialectical reading of the history of philosophy takes shape, right? What appear to be contradictions, if held in synchrony, diachronically become phases in a process of evolution. He says a tradition is defined by the set of problems that the tradition takes seriously. Yeah, I mean, I think of Bergson here. I think in his late book on metaphysics. Oh, no, it's called The Creative Mind, but it's about metaphysics. And at least it was translated into English as The Creative Mind. And Bergson talks about how metaphysics is really about, it's the art of creating your own problems and, realizing once you've asked the question, the answer is in some sense already implied. Jay Lizard says, I'm about to visit Lucretius on the nature of the universe. A Penguin Classic is all. Yeah, cool. Enjoy your reading of Lucretius. Yeah, B says Collingwood said that metaphysics is about absolute presuppositions. Okay. I can roll with that. Metaphysics. What do the rest of you think metaphysics is? Ashton, what do you think metaphysics is, if you're still here? I think it's supposed to be first philosophy, but some metaphysicians make something else first philosophy. That's an interesting move, right? Like Levinas makes ethics first philosophy, and in some sense, Schopenhauer and the Romantics, like you could say, Novalis, you could say they make aesthetics first philosophy. Some people make math first philosophy. But what does it mean to just like accept metaphysics as this challenge of not knowing where you're supposed to begin because you're always in the middle of things? I mean, that's kind of how I would look at it. And then, metaphysics is the creation of the problems we attempt to solve, the questions we attempt to answer, but it's also, if we're doing it well, a recognition of the difference between what's possible and what's necessary. So on the one hand, you might think of metaphysics initially as just like speculation about what could be the case. It's not really testable, and so people say it's not scientific. But on the other hand, metaphysics is also not just about possibility, it's about necessity, but it's about, I guess it's the interplay between possibility and necessity, which is like, is that actuality? Is that the becoming of the actual world? The process of actualization is like this attempt to hold pure possibility and pure necessity together, and like metaphysics is the response to this situation. Yeah, I mean, metaphysics could be a lot of things. Let's see what you guys think. Is there any place for mysticism in metaphysics? Jay Lizard is asking. I mean, absolutely, but mysticism seems to me to be, this is what people like Emerson and Steiner and Ken Wilber, I'm just throwing names out, but they would say mysticism is more emotional. It's on the level of like direct feeling or intuition, and you don't really necessarily need to or want to talk about it very much. Metaphysics is pretty talkative. It's pretty, articulated and articulating, and it wants to be able to not just, like witness and dissolve into the ground of being, but be with being and to dialogue with being in a sense. And, there's a lot. Metaphysicians just want to speak onto silence, and some would damn them for it. And I think others, well, if you hear from them, it's because they're trying to do the same thing, I guess. But mysticism is certainly important because eventually we have to just like shut up and listen. And so there's always a place for mysticism. If you don't have access to mystical experience, then you're not listening. You're not listening to being. But we don't want to be left with a dichotomy between just listening and speaking. And so I guess the trick is to learn to speak with your ears if you follow, to treat speech not as yours, not as mine or yours, not as something owned by anyone, but as like logos it's what's between us, and so nobody owns it, but it's not just silent, it's also pure communication, perpetual communication, if you want. Okay, let's see what other people are thinking here. Thanks for that question, Jay Lizard, about mysticism. Ashton says, he's quoting our colleague Jacob Sherman, quote, "We find ourselves confronted with a world that not only invites but even demands speculative and metaphysical supplement, a world that is already, as world, generating theory." End quote. That's beautiful. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, the world itself is, I haven't mentioned the human being yet, but I think metaphysics is certainly, the human is the metaphysical animal, right? It's certainly part of what defines us as a being. I was going to say species, but in some sense, if we're defining the human as a species, then we're not really acknowledging the human. We're putting what we are among the animals, and I don't mean to put animals down, or plants, or microbes, or minerals and crystals. I don't mean to put any of the universe down, but the human being is different. We don't have to think of it like a pyramid. Like, to say the human being is not an animal is to put the human being on top as master of something that's just a bunch of dead stuff awaiting our plan for it. We're also animal, but we're different than animals too. And I think whatever metaphysics is, that madness or that grace, whatever the need to know what's beyond the physical, what's beyond the sensual, that is a human. That's the human essence in some sense. And if the human being is in the world, it's as if the world itself is calling forth its own explanation, its own consciousness, right? And so human beings are here. Without the human becomes somehow, right? And the human has this task maybe to bring the possible and the necessary together to actualize it. Maybe that's what freedom is, what we're trying to discover, freedom. And if we discover it, it's going to be because we created it. Metaphysics is full of these paradoxes. That's why it's easy to get lost, and it's easy for a culture to dismiss the very discipline of metaphysics itself, because it seems so wild and undisciplined, perhaps. Anyways, great quote from Jake Sherman. That's from his, I'm assuming, Ashton, that's from his essay, his thesis on Teilhard, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Owen Barfield, An Ever Diverse Pair. B says, yes, mystics are those who explore the universe without metaphysics. I don't know about that. They just, they're doing the silent half of metaphysics, the listening half. And, metaphysicians or philosophers are the ones who, want to speak with Sophia. They're called to say. But if you're doing metaphysics well, it's because you can be mystical and receptive of what's there while also, not dissolving your own creative agency in the process, but contributing something back. Nunya Business says, how is that exactly separate from metaphysics, though? Isn't mysticism just a non-rational way of knowing the true nature of reality? Yeah, I don't think mysticism is separate from metaphysics at all. I think it's essential to it. It's necessary for it, but it is possible to be a mystic and not be a metaphysician, in the sense that you're not, again, like compelled to talk about it with people, with others, with other metaphysicians, with other people in general, and to learn, not just by listening and studying and absorbing, but also by expressing and articulating and giving, right? Not just receiving the gift. But mystics, even, mystics, and this idea of like a passive, silent, contemplative sort of life that a mystic would want to get dissolved in, I think is, well, it's an incomplete human life in some sense, but no one can actually pull it off, because we're all, even a silent, mystic ends up, so long as they remain embodied, and in any way visible or accessible to other human beings, even the most, pure renunciate sannyasin, who's just like given everything up to be a monk or to be a devotee, they're still in the world. They're still a symbol for others. Some people just, I guess, are more obsessed by the alphabet and want to, speak about it, speak about it, and engage logos as a world creating, not a tool. As soon as we think of language as a tool, then we're done for. We're not actually speaking. We're just wielding a weapon. If language is treated as a weapon, like a stone tool or something, then it's not actually accomplishing its purpose. Language needs to be something that's between us, that's not mine or yours. Like there's no such thing as a private language. So I don't know. I'm not trying to separate mysticism and metaphysics. I'm just trying to distinguish the two, I guess. Let's see. Connor asked, do I know if Whitehead addresses sex? Not really, not directly. I mean, the closest he gets is talking about, a young man. So he says a young man does not initiate dancing with his partner by assembling like a group of patches of color together into a woman. Like, no, he or she like rushes into the dance floor to dance with that partner. We think of, this is Whitehead's critique of like the idea of experience as ultimately or primordially just this chaos of fragmentary perceptions that responds to in order to make any sense of it. And Whitehead says, no, the world comes to us already ordered, and there are actual beings out there, souls, and when we engage in dance with a partner, we're engaging with another soul. We're not just creating in our mind our self image, creating an image of assembled out of sense percepts of like this model of the other person, a theory of mind, of other minds. We don't engage with other people if we're healthy through a theory. Like we actually engage through a soul communion, and it's not an information processing game when you're communing with soul to soul with other people. You can't you can't really do that. But here, the question was, does Whitehead address sex? And I think the closest he gets are like these metaphors about dancing. He talks about the mother and the child to make the same point that like a child is not in a chaos of sense percepts when it's coming out of the womb for the first time, taking a first breath of oxygen and looking at the mother and at the breast. Like the child sees the soul, participates in the soul of the mother, and knows, like children can recognize their mother, not just through vision, but through all the sensory gestalt. And so really infant perception, I would say, begins in a kind of unitive, but very much flowing and, processual universe. It's not a disconnected, fragmentary fusion. Okay. I think I'm back. So I was just saying, James, in Principles of Psychology, he writes about the infant's experiences of blooming, buzzing, confusion, and this gets quoted and debated and discussed so many times in so many ways. And often I think the original context is lost because sometimes people use James's comment to reinforce or to justify this classical empiricist view of raw experience as a disconnected jumble of sense percepts that the mind has to somehow organize through processes of association or something in a space of abstraction. But that's not James's point at all. You really just need to look closer at the metaphor, like blooming, buzzing, confusion. The image he's trying to evoke in you is of a field of flowers and bees hopping from bud to bud, or flower to flower. And the way in which like blooming is supposed to mean like it's vital. The infant's experience is of a network of vital connections to its environment, and the mother most of all, as this source of vibratory resonance, right? And like blooming, buzzing, like buzzing. I don't know why people think that means disconnected jumble of sensa or abstract universals. Like buzzing means resonance, like interior to interior, soul to soul. And so the infant's perception is not a chaos. If anything, it's more unitive than adult experience, because we have learned to analyze and differentiate and define. And it has really made the world into a bunch of parts as an abstract as if, right? Whereas even us adult, rational, conscious, agents recognize that at the fractal edges of our experience, there's a see, I'm going to say chaos, but really we just need to think of chaos in a different way, not as a disconnected jumble, but as an all-nourishing abyss, right? And like chaos is just the edge of our consciousness. And the thing about consciousness is it's always expanding. And so this boundary between chaos, so-called, and order is really, that boundary is all that there is. Like that's where we are in the middle of things. The situation from out of which metaphysics blossoms. So anyways, I just wanted to clear that up about William James and the blooming, buzzing confusion. I mean, he does say confusion, but the point there is fusion, unity. Like we're fused together, we're confused with, as infants, this ecology of souls and spirits around us. And we only gradually grow up out of the fusion into a kind of delusion of separateness, buffered self, right, as Taylor says. So that was all in response to, do you know if Whitehead addresses sex, right? The mother-child relationship, I thought, really is related to sex, these dancing metaphors, but he doesn't actually talk about like fucking, if that's what you mean. Very few philosophers talk about that, which is unfortunate. It needs to be talked about. Anyways, back to MacIntyre. B asked, he says MacIntyre was a follower of Hegel and all historical thinkers. He advances his ideas by writing histories of thinkers he wants to engage with. Yeah, and that's basically what I do. I like that method. Jay Lizard says, Nietzsche called Socrates the great seducer. What do you think is the most seductive quality of metaphysics? What draws philosophers to metaphysics but then leaves them hanging? Well, I mean, abstraction is what leaves us hanging, and like the risk of metaphysics is overgeneralization. Which can leave us free-floating in empty space. And that's why, Heidegger and Nietzsche would say, like, metaphysics is nihilism, because it's the inframing of being. Like, metaphysics becomes, in the West, they claim, Heidegger and Nietzsche, they claim that metaphysics becomes this drive for technological mastery. And in some sense, if what they mean by that, and what they did mean by that, Heidegger especially meant, when he says metaphysics in the mid-20th century in which he's living, he means this sort of mathematical physicist, operationalized form of scientific knowledge production that is fully like plugged into a sort of techno-industrial capitalist and communist and fascist at the time, actually 3 different ways of doing this, but a sort of techno-industrial, let's say, complex working itself out through atomic research, the atomic bomb, which transformed physics all of a sudden. Like, you had a bunch of nerds scribbling on paper these arcane symbols, and then all of a sudden you had atom bombs and nuclear energy, and it led the government to all of a sudden have a lot of money to spend on particle physics and advanced nuclear physics, and it made scientific research, though, classified, like top secret, and you have a smaller group of scientists hired by the government that get to do all the research, and everyone else is considered to be literally an enemy. Like you had nations with their own groups of scientists competing with one another to produce more deadly world-ending weapons, right? And you can't understand science in the 20th and 21st century without recognizing the way that it became wedded to the techno-industrial war machine. I mean, so when I think about what Nietzsche and Heidegger were trying to warn us of, I totally think that kind of metaphysics needs to be met and faced and rejected, but we can only reject it if we have a better metaphysics to replace it with. So I wouldn't want to just equate metaphysics and technological mastery and the idea of knowledge as this kind of certainty, this like possession of being. Philosophy is not possession of knowledge. It's a relationship with wisdom. It's very different. It's not. There's just as much ignorance in philosophy as there is knowledge at the end of the day. But yeah, I think we have to go beyond Nietzsche and Heidegger too. Ashton, maybe Nietzsche is the actual great seducer. Yeah. In our time, I think that's true. Nietzsche is actually, because if you're like 17 years old and you read Nietzsche for the first time and you haven't yet read Plato or Descartes or Augustine or Kant, the German idealist, if you haven't yet read them and you read Nietzsche first, then you're going to think that they're all like weak and unworldly and like irrelevant. But Nietzsche, you have to remember, was also pretty sickly, actually, and weak. I mean, brilliant, absolutely far-seeing, brilliant cultural critic and prophet. Let's just be honest, he's a prophet. But he doesn't provide us with the bridge from the sense of a separate self who feels really guilty about trying to master the world. He doesn't provide us with the bridge from that delusion to reconnecting with the soul of the world. Like he definitely recognized where culture was headed, though, and the descent. But I mean, in so many ways, I think the proper reading of Nietzsche is as a kind of esoteric Christian. I mean, that's how Rudolf Steiner would read him ultimately. He's like really trying to get us to pay attention to the death of God and to the corpse, and to recognize that, yeah, don't turn away from the reflection of your being, which is your physical body, but recognize it as a reflection of what? A Superman, but a spirit ultimately. But to know that spirit, to not just know it, but be it, you have to die first. And Nietzsche's favorite philosopher ultimately, I think, is probably Heraclitus, right? And his sense that, I mean, Goethe put it best, we have to die to become, we have to die to create. Creation is a dying into the created. But the good news is that, you resurrect, but as something new, as something different. And that's what creation is, right? Oh, Ashton's correcting me that quote by Jake Sherman earlier is actually from his book, Partakers of the Divine. Very good book on contemplative theology, a participatory reading of contemplative theology. Yeah, thanks for that correction. Connor asks, do I know of anywhere in Whitehead's work where he addresses things like sex, violence, pathos, the Dionysian, etc.? Yeah. In Process and Reality, when he's talking about theology, he's talking a lot about violence and the Dionysian. Sex, like, he talks about Eros a lot, and he talks about genes, but he doesn't talk about human sex, no. He's too Victorian for that. But he was definitely in touch with the sensual dimension of life. I mean, at least in his philosophy and in his teaching, his pedagogy, apparently in his parenting and his marriage as well, he was definitely a process relational guy. Very congenial and willing to participate fully in the lives of the people around him. So he's definitely an erotic guy in the platonic sense. But yeah, I don't know, not much about sex in particular. But the Dionysian, I mean, his god is more like, I think, well, let's say his god, Whitehead's god, is just as much like Pan, or he says Ate, which is like this trickster goddess of the Norse mythology. His god has a irascible side and a loving side. But God is seeking intensity, as Whitehead says, right? God isn't seeking the greatest good for the greatest number, or some stupid utilitarian conception of what the good is. God is seeking intensity of experience and like beauty, which is not always going to be maintaining the order that we're used to, or some kind of Apollonian order. So there's a lot that's Dionysian in Whitehead's whole process theology. B asks, what draws people to metaphysics and the promise of laying bare the fundamental patterns of reality? What draws us to it? I mean, exactly what Jake Sherman was saying earlier in this quote that Ashton shared. The world itself seems to call out for some kind of metaphysical supplement, for some kind of speculative imagination that would be the consciousness of itself, that would be the world's own consciousness. The metaphysician is really just trying to respond to that calling, I think. And that might seem like really too much. Like, how could any one metaphysician speak the world's pattern? I don't think I don't think one could, but I think together as a member of a larger body, metaphysicians, like in community with one another, could grow the communal body required to actually give voice to the world, to give voice to the whole world. We can't do it as like individual authors of metaphysical treatises, but we can do it as a social historical organism, right? That's evolving in time through and with an ecology of ideas that's transforming us as we go. I think but we have to give up the desire to lay bare, to make naked the fundamental patterns of the world. Like, that's too much, that old. That's the technological metaphysics of mastery that wants to lay bare. Like, there's always another veil. I don't think naked reality is it's a delusion that creates this temptation for something that we're never going to be able to reach. You know, the whole idea of laying bare, I think, is a false, is rooted in a false conception of reality, right? It's this as if it were some kind of ultimately appearance reality division. I mean, I think Nietzsche's right. Like, when the fable of truth is finally given up and the distinction between appearance and reality is canceled, you're not left with mere appearance, right? Because mere appearance was just the polar complement to true essence. And if, there are no such true essences, then we need a new concept of appearance too. And so, already in Nietzsche, there is embedded the seed for a post-nihilistic metaphysics, but he didn't have the soil to plant it himself, or he wasn't properly watered. I don't know what happened with Nietzsche, but yeah, we need to, other birds will fly further, right? Oh, Jay Lizard gave me $2. Thank you. That's like my first YouTube tip ever. I'll take it. Oh, the Lost Scrapbook is here. Hey, I'll be checking this out in the morning. Happy birthday. Thank you. Whitehead was Victorian. Oh, yeah. Nunez asking if her internet is farting or mine, and I think it was probably mine. Hopefully you didn't lose too much. I was trying to talk about the blooming, buzzing confusion at the time, so. B says, my favorite mystic is Neville Goddard. I don't think I know who that is. He said, God is your imagination. Under analysis, what he means is God is consciousness. That's why God told Moses his name is I am, which is awareness of being. I think Blake was probably the first one to say God is your imagination, or God is the imagination, or Jesus Christ is the imagination, or some variation of all of these. I mean, I have lots of time for that idea. Jay Lizard asks, can one's mystic voice be reduced to simply another aspect of their psyche or personality? I guess it could be reduced to it. I wouldn't recommend it. Unless you're talking about alchemical reduction. If you're talking about scientific reduction, like, that's just dumb. We should stop doing it. Yep, it's my 37th birthday. Can't believe it. B asked if I've read any Hermeticism. Yeah. I've read too much. I don't mean that, like, shouldn't have read it. I just mean I've read a lot. Lizard says, I love that answer. Overgeneralization. Interesting spin. Thanks. Yeah. To the question earlier, I guess, about how metaphysics can go wrong, or I don't know if that was the exact question, but. YouTube says this comment is held for review. Oh, because you said the F word, so I had to approve that. Are you familiar? CFHSCHRH says, are you familiar with the works of Bataille? Yes. I've read The Accursed Share, and I think that might be it. No, he's written on religion. I've read like an essay on religion that he wrote, but that's it really with Bataille. But Accursed Share, a marvelous book that I hope to spend more time with. But I've written about it too. Earlier you said something about how philosophers don't talk about fucking. and they should. And Bataille does talk about that. That's a great example of a philosopher who does talk about that. Artaud does, and Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, there's lots of places you could, if you want to read about philosophy of sex. It's very interesting to philosophize about sex, but it's also, I mean, you could do it while philosophizing, you know? I mean, that sounds hot to me, but anyways, on the other hand, they seem like at this moment in human evolution, they're clearly just at opposite ends of some kind of a procedural existence that, like, we modern human beings have created for ourselves. And even in the ancient world, I mean, already philosophy was kind of ascetic. It was, focused on often a kind of withdraw from the senses, unless you were an Epicurean. But it was, yeah. And I've tried to write about this myself. I have a blog post about the Alexandrian philosopher, Neoplatonist, Hypatia, who, at least, and there was a film made about this not too many years ago that I saw while I was in Europe back in 2010, and when I wrote this piece. And it's like the antipodes of philosophy, sexual and celestial antipodes of philosophy. And I think there's a lot there, and I'll try to write more about it. And I think it's important. Let's see. Yeah, people should read Bataille. Connor says, I intended a broader question about whether he addresses so-called Dionysian topics, for example, sex, but also partying, violence, yada, yada. I'm in downtown Hollywood here. Not sure what's going on. Sounds like a fire truck. No, it's an ambulance. Just one. Crazy times out there, though. Yeah. Jay Lizard's talking about the death of God being removed from philosophy by materialism. Yeah. Nina says to Jay Lizard, I think we only have a personal psyche in a very limited sense, and the voice, as much as it is ours, comes beyond anything we can call ourself. Jay Lizard said a voice said Paul Tillich, but he hardly has ever heard of this person. And then he found out that Paul Tillich is buried in the same state that he lives in, Indiana. Tillich wrote his dissertation on Schelling's philosophy of God, of philosophy of revelation, and I think he's worth reading for an existential understanding of, how Christianity still is like it's the cultural code, that grants us clearest access to the structure of our psyche. Like, if you're in the West, if you're in parts of Asia or anywhere in the world, I mean, we're all increasingly spread out, but you're not a member of if you're not a Christian, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Jew, you could be indigenous, you could be any number of allying with any number of wisdom traditions, which gives you some taste of the ground of being, as Tillich would say. But I guess for me, in my cultural nexus, I've happened to be born into the zeitgeist and the geokarmic situation that I've dropped into seems to me to require, this kind of esoteric Christian exegesis at the end of the day, which is kind of unexpected for me, at least autobiographically. Never expected that I would come back around to that. But I don't know, to even call it Christian risks associating myself with all sorts of fundamentalisms operating in the Russian Orthodox Church just as much as in America's evangelical churches and fundamentalist movements. And I certainly don't find anything, healthy in those forms of expression. And clearly, Christianity and many other traditional wisdom traditional wisdom lineages have contributed to plenty of violence and discord and judgment, and have not been a force for good in the world. But anyways, my critique of classical theism would be that it tends to imagine God in the image of a dictator, of Caesar. And this is just, I'm parroting Whitehead here, but I think this is my favorite part of Whitehead's philosophy, rather of his theology, his process theology, is that he rejects this false equivalence between human political power and a kind of domination, hierarchical domination that we associate with human political power historically, with the nature of this axial revelation across continents, to Buddha, to Moses, to Socrates, to Confucius. This is an insight, a revelation that should not be misidentified with a dictator, master of the universe type of image. I think classical theism is ignoring the whole point of the incarnation, and what it means for God to become flesh, for the Logos to become flesh and die into the earth as a human being. I think that deed, that event, has philosophical significance ultimately, and it's worth talking about what that significance is. I don't know if this is the venue for it. I'll have to do another live thing for that, because we're coming up on an hour here, and I'm going to need to wrap this up. So can't be going into the incarnation at T-minus 5 minutes. Yeah, Jay Lizard says, a few years ago I thought astrology was dumb. Now it might be everything. Mentions Crowley, who seems to call sex charioting. Yeah, astrology is it's a very strange topic. Can't just be dismissed as unscientific. Not that it's science. I don't think astrology is science, but to dismiss it as unscientific is to totally miss the point of what it's about, I think. In terms of Jung and his view of magic and synchronicity, I mean, without Jung, I wouldn't know how to take astrology seriously. Without his understanding of synchronicity, I wouldn't even know where to begin making sense, given my upbringing in this like basically scientific materialist context and my schooling in that worldview. Without Jung, astrology just couldn't even like register in my universe, right? But Jung all of a sudden reminds us that our psyche and that our phenomenology of existence as a human being is embedded not only in a human cultural history and collective unconscious, but that collective unconscious reaches back through the lineages of prior organisms that we are descended from, to the first cell or cells that emerged in the history of life on Earth, to the deeper origins of the mineral physical universe that we observe around us. We're all embedded in this large cosmological synchronicity, and so I think Jung is exactly why a portal remains open to the mystery of astrology in the modern age. So he's super important. He says my Jung kick turned me on to Kirby Surprise, who was a great philosopher of synchronicity, has a great philosophy of synchronicity. I don't know about Kirby. Kirby Surprise is a great name for a philosopher of synchronicity, though. He's really figured out something fundamental, in my opinion. I'll have to look him up. Nunya hasn't heard of him either. Some guy says Bataille is really great and angsty. I agree. CFHSCRHR asks how I would recommend starting to read philosophy systematically. I'm the wrong person to ask for advice about that. I don't think I read very systematically. I read widely and somewhat chaotically, but always like following a trail that I lay down as I walk, right? So it's not systematic. It's more just like Whitehead called it a method of assemblage. That was his philosophic method. He tells us in Modes of Thought. He says it's assemblage, not system. I'm kind of the same way. So I read what feels relevant at the time to whatever I'm trying to figure out. B's into esoteric Christianity and the symbolic reading of the Bible. Yeah, cool. The young idealist says Hypatia, following Aristarchus, had hypothesized that the sun was the center of the galaxy and that the Earth revolves around the sun, or that the sun was the center of the solar system, maybe, and the Earth revolves around the sun. Yeah, Hypatia was bomb, but we don't have any of her actual writing, right? We just have other philosophers talking about her. I think that's right. I mean, the libraries at Alexandria got burned. Did she get torn apart or probably burned? I don't remember, but I should know that. By a horde of angry Christians. But yeah, I was speaking of the Pythagorean, the Pythagorean astronomers already knew about the sun being the center way before Copernicus, who was really just cribbing these ancient Greek texts. But Hypatia was aware of this as well as a Neoplatonist and a, inheritor of what had been dispersed through the Pythagorean wisdom lineage. And I've been reading Kant, but his pre-critical stuff on, as I mentioned earlier, on universal natural history and theory of heavens. And he's speculating about what nebula are. He says, no, those are other galaxies. And like he defines what a galaxy is. He talks about other Milky Ways, not for the first time, but building on a few other thinkers who had just been having these ideas. And he's, for the first time, trying to analogize the solar system that Newton has described so well, building on Kepler and Galileo and so on. And he's trying to analogize that system to the galactic system. And he's like saying, I don't know why this wasn't obvious way before this. And I haven't looked into how many prior proposals may have made this. People may have made this proposal, but Kant says like the Milky Way is appears to be this diffuse light because there's so many stars there, and that we're actually in this disk formation, and like the nebulas are disks that we're looking at various orientations, at various angles, so they take on slightly different shapes. But he's saying that there's this sort of fractal nesting of planetary system with satellites, in solar system with sun, in galaxy with super sun. But he actually thought Sirius was the center of our super solar system galaxy, Milky Way, rather than the center of it that we know now, and the bulge of the disk, for some interesting geometrical reason that I couldn't quite track. But in any event, it's very interesting to track the history of astronomy as a kind of mirror of the evolution of consciousness, because situating ourselves in cosmic space is an act of imagination. And how we believe we have situated ourselves in space is, over the course of relatively recent history, has just fundamentally transformed. And so it's really, to get a sense of orientation in the actual universe, you have to inherit that whole history of metamorphosis through the development of astronomy, and it's mind-bending. All right, let me see if there's any other important comments here, but I think I'm gonna turn in for the night here in a second. This has been fun though. Sam 1600 asks about agriculture and what I think about its place in creating an ecological future. I've done so little farming in my life, but I certainly recognize the importance of it. And I have this dream of being more on the land, but I also don't want to be naive about it, and I'm not quite sure how to integrate the dream with my sort of very academic, in the good sense, I hope, of just being more of a thinker than a planter. Farming, I guess if you have a large community and you're all contributing, not all 40 hours a week to it, then it's doable. But that's a community farm, and communities are hard. I love them, but they're hard. So yeah, farming is essential, but we need to do it locally and in community. And to transition from the form of like subjectivation, the form of social conditioning that we live in this late capitalist techno dystopia, to eco-localism of some kind, which includes like some form of local organic or biodynamic agricultural practice. To get from like point A to point B is going to be, it might need to be catastrophic. Like the only way to shift the basin of attraction from agro-industrial civilization of the kind that's been possessed by this technological metaphysics that we've been talking about of mastery. If that's what's driving our agricultural practice, then we're gonna run out of soil in like 2 generations. It's gonna be nuts. But if humanity does survive the coming evolutionary bottleneck, it will be because we've relocalized in certain northern climes that have become more habitable because of climate change. And so humanity will survive what's coming, but what's coming is going to be terminal for our civilization. It just is. But civilization as we've known it is not the only way to remain human. And in fact, it might be necessary to remain human to end this technological civilization, which doesn't mean getting rid of technology, just so don't like misunderstand me, but it does mean seeking out technological capacity for different reasons, and not making technological progress the be all and end all of your entire existence, right? And I think the technological religion, and this might be the last thing I'll say, that is increasingly being encouraged, and that is increasingly winning minds. I don't know about hearts. It's not very. It's kind of heartless, but it's winning minds. Whether it's the simulation hypothesis or some kind of transhumanist, technological extensions of physiology and consciousness that people are imagining is going to be possible. These religions, I think, are, well, let's just say it's a very dangerous historical moment, because these religions are leading us to imagine that death is an enemy, that death is the enemy, that we're supposed to transcend nature. We're supposed to separate ourselves from this ancient lineage of vital expression, and upload onto some kind of mineral, crystal, silicon platform that's somehow not going to need to be powered in a giant server farm in an air-conditioned building on the surface of the earth somewhere. Maybe we'll start doing it in space soon, but still, it's going to need to be powered. You're going to need batteries. And so this whole transcendent techno escapism ultimately is rooted in the delusion that you could power the computer that would be simulating your consciousness indefinitely, like without using the resources of the earth. And like, okay, maybe you'll capture an asteroid, but like, how long do you want to play this game? And like fail to recognize that there's the future of the human being is not on another planet in this physical universe. Like, the human being is born, and as we know it, is born and will die with the earth. There's no escape from that. All right. I'm going to bed. Thank you for the happy birthdays, and for listening. And it was fun for me. Hope it was interesting for you. Thanks for the great comments and questions. See you guys next time.